And to discuss this further, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Kamel Hawwash. He's a professor at the University of Birmingham, and by Mehrdad Khonsari. He's a former Iranian diplomat who served in Washington, at the UN, and in London. Before I begin with you gentlemen, I just want to quickly run a soundbite from Ibrahim Kalin, who we interviewed earlier. Let's listen to what he had to say.
It's no longer about Daesh or eliminating terrorist threats in Syria. Syria is becoming a platform, a theater for another regional proxy war between Russia, Iran regime on the one hand, Hezbollah and other Shia militia, and the United States and its supporters on the other. If that is to be the focus of the conflict in Syria, that means that we are in for another protracted war in Syria, where even if we eliminate all these terrorists, etc., this proxy war will continue.
Ibrahim Kalin there speaking on an endless proxy war in Syria. Let's begin with you, Mehrdad. Are we looking at an endless proxy war in Syria?
Well, that is certainly a possibility if, for example, Iran and Saudi Arabia are able to reach some form of an accommodation vis-a-vis their respective situations in Yemen and Syria. For example, if the Saudis give recognition to the gains that Iran has made in Syria in sort of as a quid pro quo for Iranian disengagement in Yemen, obviously this scenario could be avoided. And of course, through Saudi, you might say, conduit, others can be persuaded to sort of let go and allow Iran to sort of remain in a good position, you might say, or consolidate its position.
Let me play the devil's advocate. They're saying that we're looking at an endless proxy war. This is nothing new. We saw Saudi Arabia use its proxies. Iran has been involved in this conflict for many years now. So what is different this time, Kamel, as far as you're concerned? How do you see it?
Well, I think we now have another player, which is Russia, who is in Syria. And I think most countries are looking to Russia to see if it can, first of all, keep a lid on things. Because, I mean, I try and imagine in 5 years' time, if we looked back, would we see a major confrontation, a big war? Although it's dangerous to predict the future, I think not. So it will continue to be a sort of status quo unless and until the Syrian regime perhaps reasserts its authority. But every time it seems to over the whole land, which is quite a big ask with the various players who are there. So I just see this continuing bubbling under the surface. Some groups, some factions are in favor with this country, and then suddenly they fall out of favor. So it's an uncertain sort of immediate future, but I think it will be a case of sort of status quo. And of course, particularly for Israel, I think that's what it wants. It wants to see a sort of status quo where Syria isn't really rebuilt, doesn't gather back its military strength. I was going to say...
You mean the Syrian regime?
The Syrian regime. But at the same time, it would like to see Iran completely out of not just Syria, but out of Iraq as well. But Iran has developed its influence right up to the Israeli border.
Who does this status quo or this current scenario, this current map serve? Which interests are served the best, in your opinion, Mehrdad?
Well, the only interest we can say that is not served is that of the Syria or the Syrian people.
Absolutely.
But I would say that if low-level violence can end according to the kind of outline you just made, Iran would be in a favorable situation, because Iran would be able to, as you mentioned, extend its influence all the way to the Mediterranean. This is something that Iran has never been in a position, that it has never been in such a favorable position for centuries. And even during the time of the Shah of Iran, when Iranian foreign policy was trying to project itself, it could never imagine that it could be in a position of this nature. However, that is contingent on Iran being able to consolidate its gain.
Well, that's the question. Has Iran overstretched its hand?
Iran has the answer to that question, only time will tell. If Iran is able to consolidate this, and we don't know at this stage whether it won't, If it consolidates itself, this position, then obviously it will be in a position of advantage. If low-level violence continues, that is when the question of Iran being overstretched will come into play.
The argument is that the low-level violence has largely been controlled with these deals that have been reached between Turkey, Russia, and Iran in Astana, for example, setting up these de-escalation zones. You're mentioning Russia's role. What is Russia's endgame in all of this? Iran seems to be a more natural ally to Bashar al-Assad. What is Russia's interest in all of this?
Well, of course, it has a base. It wanted a foothold in that region. Putin wants to increase his influence as a world leader. It isn't quite a superpower in the same way the Soviet Union was, but that's part of reasserting its presence and influence. And I think then and you can see that because when the recent escalation between Syria and Israel happened, who did Netanyahu turn to try and calm the situation? It wasn't Donald Trump. It was actually Putin. And then I think the Americans spoke to Putin. So Russia has put itself in that role of being the overseer of what happens in Syria. It's trying to keep its sort of friendship and relations with all countries. But it was interesting that earlier this week, when an official from a Russian official said, if it comes to it, we will be with Israel's security. So that's something all the others have to remember.
That Russia will keep all its options open. Interesting fact there. Another thing that happened recently was the reports of Russian mercenaries or contractors being killed by US firing or artillery shelling on regime positions. But then reports emerged that both countries, Russia and the US, were trying to suppress these reports in the first place. What's happening there?
Well, I think that they'd like to keep, I mean, the Russians definitely want to keep this sort of less exposed, if you will. But I think that just following up on the question that you just asked, Syria and the current situation has provided the first scenario where after 39 years of propaganda by Iran against Israel, there is a possibility of a direct confrontation, especially since Israel has given warning to Iran that it should not use its presence in Syria to set up military bases or air bases or for its submarines to visit Latakia and things of that nature.
Finally, I want both of you to answer this particular issue very quickly. We haven't discussed the YPG and the US support. Are there outliers in all of this?
From day to day, you can't be sure which group, which faction rises sort of up the agenda and then disappears from the agenda. So I'm reluctant to make a judgment on that because I literally think it's a day-to-day sort of analysis of the situation.
US support of the YPG?
Sorry?
US support of the YPG?
Yes.
I think that it's very difficult for the US to extricate itself easily from this proposition. And obviously the Kurds over the centuries have always been sort of dealt a wrong hand at the wrong point. And the odds are that, that they will not prevail, you know. But what is important, I think, is that in the broader question of preventing Iranian consolidation in this region, that the Americans will continue with their support of the YPG.
Does that then bring Turkey and Iran closer?
It does bring Turkey and Iran closer, and Turkey and Iran have been close on the subject of curtailing the Kurds, whether in Iraq or Syria.
Mehrdad Khonsari, Kamel Hawwash, thank you so much.